What's happening, film fans? Hope you're all well. Just thought I'd jump on to do a kind of review of David Fincher's latest film, The Killer, which came out a couple of weeks ago now. It had a kind of a limited run in cinemas, and then is now, of course, exclusive on Netflix because it's a Netflix production. So, what's the first thing I suppose the first notable thing to say about this film is actually what's not notable about it, right? Is that it's the latest in a long tradition of films about kind of lone hitmen, hired killers, assassins, and something goes wrong, right? A hit goes wrong, and this is essentially the plot of the film. You know, Michael Fassbender plays the eponymous The Killer, because he's a nameless character in this film. He uses obviously multiple aliases, of course, to carry out his work. Who's setting up a job in Paris in the opening chapter of the film, which of course inevitably goes wrong. And the rest of the film is about him trying to restore a sense of order and control that he's built up, living the life that he leads as this kind of contract killer. And that's the kind of pattern that we see throughout a lot of kind of hired killer, hitman, assassin movies, right? That kind of subgenre. So the question then becomes, how does this film differentiate from all those that have come before? In what is kind of a highly kind of populated subgenre. You remember this film, I think, premiered, I think, at the same film festival of Venice as another movie of a similar vein, which is Richard Linklater's latest film, The Hitman, which I think in the UK is due out either later this year or beginning of next year, which Netflix have also picked up. So I doubt they want to release them at the same time because that would be an overcrowded market for these films. But it just goes to show like how popular and how much of a tradition these films are. This one in particular, I think, is based off of a French graphic novel. But I think the main source of inspiration for Fincher is indeed those hitman movies of the kind of the 60s and the 70s, right? Jean-Pierre Melville's The Samurai, and the kind of conspiracy assassin movies of the 70s, you know, Dare the Jackal, Michael Winner's The Mechanic, the Charlie Bronson movie, and Don Siegel's Charlie Varick, for example. Kind of unconscious or loose inspirations, I think, for David Fincher. So I'll be looking at this from the perspective of how does it differentiate itself, if at all, and where does it kind of place in the context of David Fincher's work, David Fincher as a director, who my general thoughts are as follows, which is that I think David Fincher on top form is capable of making, and has made, some of the great American movies, I'd say, of the 21st century. But I do find him to be a consistently inconsistent director, if that oxymoron makes sense. Which you know, I literally find to almost to a pattern that he makes a good film or a great film, then a not so good one, a good one and a not so good one. Like I say, almost to a pattern. That's my subjective experience of an opinion of Fincher anyway. I haven't seen Mank, so I can't speak for that, but which is, of course, was his first Netflix production. He, of course, first did Mindhunter, the series for Netflix, which got cancelled in between the end of the second and what was going to be, I think, a third series, the third season. So you thought that might have soured or made Fincher a bit hesitant in partnering with Netflix again, but he's made his last two films with them, so obviously the bank of Netflix is very persuasive, I think, as it were. And I think I get a sense that the directors have a great sense of directorial control, judging by Scorsese's experience with them, with The Irishman, Killers of the Flower Moon, which I think is still out in some cinemas in this country. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend going to see that film as well. But in regards to The Killer, so how does it differentiate itself? Well, like I say, I've given a brief summary of the plot, and I think the litmus test for audiences is going to be how you take the first 20-30 minutes of this film. The film is split up into kind of 5 or 6 chapters and then an epilogue. And the first chapter of this film is like a quarter of the movie's running time. It's about half hour. The film's 2 hours long. And the first chapter is this segment in Paris in which we see Michael Fassbender's character preparing for this job, waiting for his target to arrive in this hotel across the street. He's set up in this kind of empty WeWork office space, which is an interesting choice for a setting, which I'll get into what I think characterizes and distinguishes The Killer as being a very interesting film for me. And I will say right off the bat that I do really like this film, and I think like a lot of Fincher's best films, the need or the compulsion for me to rewatch this again shortly after seeing it for the first time is there. And that's characteristic of a lot of Fincher's best work for me. And I think that's because, like a lot of Fincher's films, because I think for this, some have questioned David Fincher's like motivational desire as to why he specifically, what drew him to this material, why did he make The Killer? For me, it's a pretty obvious answer. It's an obvious question to answer, which is that it's a film about a kind of an obsessive, and a kind of an obsessive who is obsessed with the tasks and the works that he carries out. And Fincher being attracted to these kind of obsessives and being fascinated by processes that people subject themselves to or are fascinated by themselves. He's very much a director of processes. In fact, I'd even characterize his late work, his narrative style, as a kind of cinema of interruptions. Interruptions to processes in particular, which makes Fincher a very intensely visual filmmaker who's, like I say, fascinated by processes and the compulsions that drive people to be obsessed with certain things. This puts this film to me in similar company to, for example, Zodiac, Social Network, Gone Girl, to some extent The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo as well. So I don't quite understand the people that say that question why exactly Fincher made this film in particular, because I think it's there. It's quite obvious. So I think that kind of, in his best work, that kind of rubs off on the viewer. You become the obsessive yourself, and you need to kind of like almost like conquer the material and watch it again, and you get really, really caught up in the relationships between things and processes and characters. And that makes Fincher a kind of highly forensic and analytical filmmaker, particularly, like I say, particularly visually. The opening is a great example of this, right? I think the opening of this film is almost like a masterclass of like show don't tell narrative exposition, show don't tell filmmaking, very Hitchcockian, akin to Rear Window, which is interesting actually because Fincher uses you have Michael Fassbender who's got this one window that he looks out of onto his target, which is across the street. There's like a courtyard in between, I think. That's across the street, and he frames that window like a painting looking out into another world. Very similar to how Hitchcock frames James Stewart's character, who looks out into the courtyard of all the houses in Rear Window. That kind of dollhouse set that Hitchcock, of course, constructed for that film. So the opening is very Hitchcockian, and of course Fincher is a huge admirer of Hitchcock and his work. I think in particular Rear Window probably. And both have these, kind of, like I say, show don't tell filmmaking of visual clues and information that's kind of almost overloads the viewer at the beginning. And so there's a lot of information to process, including a kind of almost borderline incessant voiceover by the protagonist, Michael Fassbender's character, in which he kind of details the tediousness, the boredom of his work and his habits of routine and his moral code and philosophy, which is primarily that of a kind of cynical. Well, no, he actually says his worldview isn't cynical, but then he kind of goes on to say how, it's a dog eat dog world. You need to get to the top of it, otherwise someone else will, and they'll step on you in the process. So it is indeed a kind of very nihilistic, cynical worldview he does indeed possess. And I think a lot of the humour in this film comes from the fact that I think his character isn't as smart as he thinks he is, and the situations that he puts himself in that makes himself very vulnerable or indeed further out of control as the film goes along, even when he perceives himself to be in control. And so there's a kind of self-referentiality and knowingness, I think, on the part of Fincher, in which a lot of the humour is irony on behalf of the audience going, yeah, this guy isn't as smart as he thinks he is, but at the same time, he's still no idiot. He's very capable of doing his job, as we see throughout the film. But there is this kind of, even in the voiceover, which reminded me a lot of the voiceover of Patrick Bateman, actually, in American Psycho, particularly the opening, in which there's dark humour there, there's incessant detail of routine provided, it's very narcissistic but almost insecure. There's an insecure narcissism to it, in which, like Patrick Bateman, when he's like, I can do 1,000 ab crunches now. It's that very self-assured, just almost like unknowing narcissist. They're not even aware of how much of an asshole they sound. But and the humor in that narration comes from Michael Fassbender detailing how disciplined he is, and the routine and the patience and the code that he lives by. And when he screws it up, he can only say one word, which is the F word. Kind of provides great humor, I think. But like I say, a lot of people will probably be put off by the first 20, 30 minutes of this. If you're not drawn into it, you're probably not going to enjoy the rest of the film. But I think the most distinguishing characteristics of this film, what sets it apart, is, for me, this film is distinctive of what makes Fincher a kind of great presence in American cinema, is that I think he's decidedly one of the most modern of American directors. In fact, not many people talk about this a lot, actually, with Fincher, but I would put him alongside... He's very similar to... His closest peer, I think, is Michael Mann, actually. In terms, they are both early digital converts, so they're both fascinated with the kind of like pushing the technology of the medium forward, whatever you may think about that in terms of digital versus analog. But they're both, like I say, early digital converts. Their films deal usually with obsessive, somewhat loner males, obsessed with and dedicated to their craft and their work, and how their codes and their honour are violated or threatened in the course of the film, and how they overcome them. And they're also both filmmakers who... The need and the desire on behalf of the audience, of you, the viewer, to listen and watch closely is greatly rewarded. So the greater your desire to do so, the greater you're rewarded for having done so. So they're both intentionally visual filmmakers, and they also both really know how to shoot at night as well, I think. They have very distinctive visual styles from that perspective. And... I mean, the sound design alone in this film, I think, is brilliant, as is the score by Trent Reznor, who's a frequent David Fincher collaborator. So, yeah, in that perspective, I think Fincher is one of the most decidedly modern directors, and this is a decidedly very, very modern film. It's a very modern take on how the nature of the work of the hitman has changed, almost as a result of 21st century omnipresent corporate global capital, in a way. I mentioned the empty WeWork office space earlier, and how that's been particularly interesting because it's been in the news this week, like I said. But the use of what Mark Algay called non-places is very, very noticeable in this film. A lot of the action takes place in this film in non-places. You have empty office spaces. You have the use of hotels, gyms, airports, these places that are simultaneously could be anywhere, and therefore they're also kind of nowhere. They're these kind of soulless places of the everyday that, like I said, they can literally be anywhere in the world. I think it's very interesting and indicative of the fact that a lot of the film takes place in these spaces. That, coupled with the fact that you take the empty WeWork office space, for example, it illustrates two things. One, the precarity of kind of global capital in the 21st century. The fact that this is indeed an empty and occupied office space demonstrates how the kind of volatility of economies and global markets today. And of course, it also shows how the seeming omnipresence of these global corporate entities. It's significant. That's the first stakeout scene that we're in this space, and in the same stakeout sequence, we have the character go to a McDonald's to eat whilst he's still waiting for the target. And the precise reason he goes to the McDonald's is because it's a place that literally tens of millions of people every day go to eat. So he can go there by virtue of the anonymity of using a highly corporate space, right? Such as McDonald's. And Michael Fassbender's character, even in the opening, says in the narration about how 21st century surveillance has made his job. It's impossible to be invisible. What you must do is to try and make yourself just unnoticeable, not noticed. And there's this great tension that plays out in the film between how 21st century surveillance and security techniques have made his job harder, but they also ironically enable him to carry out his work easier. For example, the omnipresence of these corporate entities are used by him throughout the film, such as the kind of the Hertz car hire, the FedEx, Amazon Prime, like I say, WeWork office spaces. All these corporate presences are used by him to help carry out his work, which ironically make him more anonymous and suggest that the killer is potentially, he's able to blend in, but he is us, as it were, because we use all these same services. And you get the sense that there's this analogy being made between the killer as being the nature of his work is he's someone for hire, right? Who's then used to kill on the behest of someone else or some other entity, as it were. And all the services he uses are indeed kind of hires, or at least mediated by kind of corporate global transactions, as it were, such as the Hertz car hire, or for example, the scooter that he uses as his getaway vehicle is indeed one which, you pay for when you use it. It's a hire vehicle again. So the fact that all of these interactions are mediated by these things, I think, is very, very significant. So it paints this kind of like collage and portrait of the sum of human interactions, or lack of, in the 21st century world that we live in. The fact that the encounter in chapter 5, or the final chapter, which I won't go into too much detail in case you haven't seen the film, but the fact that that is dictated by the very virtue that two parties have never seen each other and all their communication has been carried out by intermediary agents, is the significance there is not lost on me. And the fact that this interaction you have in the background, stocks and shares charts in the background, it's all about the idea of faceless corporate capital determining a lot of our interactions and determining our very kind of social atomization, our lack of human interaction that we now have in the world that we live in. Michael Fassbender's character laments at the beginning of the film. He kind of somewhat darkly, humorously observes that he hates long-distance killing. He rather prefers close-up killing with a knife or something, because at least there's some form of interaction involved. So even he, the killer, laments a sense of closeness and human interaction in the modern world that we now live in, which is, of course, darkly humorous and very ironic. But nonetheless, it does enable his moral code to function. He says at the beginning, that he says that he isn't cynical, and that you have to have no empathy, no emotion, all this kind of stuff. But the only way you can have that is when your interactions are facilitated precisely by minimal interaction, which the corporate world helps him maintain and facilitate. And so for me, the film is almost about the nature of him discovering the true nature of himself and his own work. Does he learn the lessons? Well, I don't know. That's for us to kind of determine, I suppose, because the ending is pretty open-ended. In fact, and this goes into the fact that I think a lot of the details in this aren't purely incidental. I think a lot of this is very much indeed a kind of commentary, whether it's conscious or unconscious, on Fincher and the writer's part. He used the same writer from the film Seven, serial killer film Seven, that he made in the 90s, which of course has a huge following. But the use of the Smiths is used frequently throughout this film, which, depending on your tolerance for the Smiths, you'll either love or hate, of course. But I think it's, again, quite wryly humorous how they're used, because their lyrics seem to reference the emotional or narrative position that the killer finds himself in when we hear those lyrics at a particular point in the story. And in fact, I think they go as far to tell us what the ending signifies or means if you listen to the lyrics when the credits come up. That's my interpretation. That's my takeaway from it, anyway. But so it's almost like the killer's alibi, of his cynical alibi, which he himself doesn't label as cynical, but I believe it is, of the kind of dog-eat-dog mentality of the world that he lives in. That alibi can only be maintained by the fact that he uses these faceless corporate entities to carry out the work. It means he doesn't need to have any empathy. And so the film is almost like kind of radically suggesting, the reason why a lot of us these days perhaps have such a distance from other people, a lack of kind of communal perspective, is indeed our over-reliance on things such as Amazon, right? And our disconnectedness in connecting those dots. So I think there's a lot of interesting things, actually. to say about this film. And I do have the need and the desire to watch it again, probably in the next week. Michael Fassbender, great reliable presence as always. I think he's fantastic in this film. I think he shows a lot of his desire, his need to show restraint in the film, emotionally speaking, but then it comes out in parts, usually based upon his judgments of other people that he's interacting with. Is quite. There's a humour there, but it's very, and he's a physical actor as well. He's a very physical actor, Michael Fassbender, in very good shape for his age. That probably has something to do with the fact that I didn't realise this, but because I was lamenting with Michael Fassbender, I was lamenting the fact that he seemed like such an omnipresent actor in the late noughties, and he's kind of gone off the boil. But as it turns out, he has an alternate career as an auto race driver now, I think. That probably explains it. So, yeah, those are probably the summation of my thoughts. Like I said, I love the score. The sound design is fantastic. Great performance by Michael Fassbender. Good cameo performance as well by Tilda Swinton, who turns up in the film. I won't discuss that too much because it might spoil some elements of the film if you haven't seen it. But yeah, those are my main thoughts. If you've seen it, let me know what you guys think. I have a feeling I might be in the minority in this one in terms of, I think, how much I enjoyed the film. Like I said, a lot of people's reactions were indifferent. But if you have seen it, let me know what you think. If you haven't, by all means, go out and see it. I recommend that you do. And yeah, if you've enjoyed this content, comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll try and be more consistent from here on. I've said that before, but I will try and be. And I'll be throwing out more reviews. I might do a review of... I have seen Killers of the Flower Moon, but I saw it a few weeks back, so I need to kind of collect my thoughts on that. And I kind of want to do a video on the kind of the debate raging around, like, how long should movies be, movie lengths, that kind of age-old debate. So yeah, that'll probably be my next video. So yeah, David Fincher's The Killer. I highly recommend it. Let me know if you've seen it and what your thoughts are. And as always, take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Take it easy.